Pastor Bill. So many people seem to agree with Karl Marx, who wrote in the Communist Manifesto, religion is the opiate of the masses. That they point to the Inquisition, they point to religious wars throughout the ages as proof that mankind would be better off without any religion at all. How would you answer that question?
Well, you hear that question quite a bit. You hear that statement, and it's like almost a I got you kind of a statement.
Yep.
And I'm happy to defend the history of Christianity, but I would want to flip that question around and say, I want you to answer, the history of atheism and the destruction that has come from that. Because here's a statistical fact. There have been more lives lost under atheistic communism in the 20th century alone. Over 135 million is a conservative estimate.
Yeah.
That's more than all the lives that were lost in all the wars that have ever been fought in human history before that time.
Wow.
And that's just in the 20th century. We're now into the 21st century, and so the numbers are just escalating. That's not counting the 500 million abortions that are taking place in a lot of communistic type settings around the world. We're not even counting that. We're talking about regimes that like Communist China, the Soviet Union, and the lives that were lost there. Now, in answer to the damage that Christianity has done, I would posit that that's not true Christianity. When you look in the Word of God, you will not see in any of Jesus' teachings or anything in the New Testament that even hints that Christians should go out and mercilessly attack people without any provocation at all and try to harm them. Now, the revisionist historians have done a good job in this area too. Take, for example, the Salem witch trials that we've always heard about. And you would think that Christians were just burning witches at the stake in Salem by the hundreds and thousands.
That's right.
But history, the facts of history, is that there were less than 25 people that were accused of witchcraft burned at the stake. It's not right. I'm not justifying it, and it's not even biblical. That's what I'm saying. If someone take, for example, the Baptist church down in Florida. What is that? What's the name of that church that's always going to these places and God hates this? And,
that's right. I know the one you mean.
Westboro Baptist Church.
Westboro
Baptist Church. Thank you. Do they represent true Christianity? I don't believe they do. I don't believe they do in any sense of the word. So just because someone says they're doing something in the name of Christ does not mean that it's an actual representation of the church that Jesus is building. That's number one. Number two, if you look at even what they supposedly did in the Crusades, many of those Crusades were put forth to stop the Islamic expansion. Because the Islamic nation was being very aggressive in taking over large parts of Europe and other places. And so some of those crusades were even justified in stopping that. But then when you get to the Inquisition, well, number one, I'm not a Catholic. And number two, the Inquisition, the selling of indulgences, the whole Roman Catholic thing and all of that, I'm not trying to offend people who are Roman Catholics, but that does not represent classical Christianity. Not in my opinion, it doesn't.
Agreed.
But when you talk about what has happened in Islam for 1,400 years, that does not disagree with the teachings of Muhammad in the Hadith, nor does it disagree with the express teachings in the Quran that says kill the infidel wherever you find them. Okay, so what they're doing today, what we call Islamic extremists, are really Islamic fundamentalists. That's all they are. They're taking literally the teachings that are in the Quran. When communist dictators come in and they wipe out 60 million people like Mao Zedong did,
Yeah.
or Joseph Stalin wipes out 12 to 15 million people, starves them to death and everything else.
Yeah.
That is the simple logical outgrowth of communism. So if they can defend their atheistic communism and give me a good defense for that and explain why all those lives have been lost, then I'll be glad to defend Christianity. Now, what I would like to talk about in the last few minutes we have left is I'm submitting to you that the worldview that has proven to be the most beneficial to the world for the last 2,000 years is the Christian worldview, the Judeo-Christian worldview. I'd like to recommend a book here by Alvin J. Smith. It's called How Christianity Changed the World. But in the interest of time, and it's an exhaustive study of the influence of Christianity for the last 2,000 years in all kinds of various categories. I'm only going to talk about two of them, in the category of education and in the category of science. I want to talk about the positive influence that Christians have had in education and in science in particular.
Okay.
So let's start with Johannes Gutenberg. You know, we read our books and we take them for granted and that sort of thing, but there was a time that people didn't have books. And certainly the common people didn't have books. And a man named Johannes Gutenberg was called Time Magazine's Man of the Millennium. Well, Gutenberg not only invented the first movable printing press in 1455 and produced the Latin language Bible in common language in Mainz, Germany, but he was a devout Christian. And he said about this, he said, "Yes, it is a press, certainly, but a press from which shall flow an inexhaustible streams the most abundant and marvelous liquor that has ever flowed to relieve the thirst of men. Through it, God will spread his word. A spring of pure truth shall flow from it. Like a new star, it shall scatter the darkness of ignorance and cause a light heretofore unknown to shine among men." That was his motivation for creating the Gutenberg Press and the Gutenberg Bible.
Wow.
It was the first book that was ever printed.
Yep.
Frederick Froebel was the originator of kindergarten, and that's German for a children's garden. See, Frederick Froebel was a devout Christian and the son of a Lutheran pastor. And one day while he was walking in the mountains and he was just observing the beautiful plants and everything, the idea came to him that would allow young children to grow up under the nurturing of in a garden for children, as it were.
Right.
And that's where kindergarten came from. And he was a devout Christian. There was a man named Abby Charles Michael Eppie. He was an ordained priest. He developed sign language for use in Paris in 1775. Then we come, and he was a devout Christian. He had a desire to help deaf people because he was a Christian. And remember, Christians believed in the intrinsic worth of people.
Yep.
People who were not Christians, if you were deaf, you were just
Get out of the way.
expendable and really, you should put them away.
Yep.
We don't even need to see them. They're undesirable.
Yep.
Louis Braille was a dedicated Christian and the inventor of what is now known as the Braille system for the blind. Louis Braille himself, at the age of 3, lost his eyesight by actually accidentally puncturing his eye with his father's awl in his father's leather shop. His father was always building things in there, and an accident happened where he lost his eyesight. And then he, out of that tragedy, grew up desiring to develop the Braille system for the blind. And it's interesting, his father used to carve images of Jesus out of leather in the shop for his son so that he could feel the image.
Wow.
And that gave him an idea.
Yeah.
And so that came out of that. Lying on his deathbed, Louis Braille said this: I'm convinced that my mission is finished on earth. I tasted yesterday the supreme delight. God condescended to brighten my eyes with the splendor of eternal hope. And so we already see the influence of Christianity, the positive influence of Christianity on education. And what about higher learning? Well, October the 28th in 1636, the Harvard University became the first and now the oldest institution of higher learning in the U.S. And Harvard was originally a Christian institution.
Right.
A lot of people don't realize that.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
It was founded by the Congregational Church. And in Harvard's original handbook, rule number 1 was that students seeking entrance must know Latin and Greek so they could study the scriptures.
Wow.
That was rule number 1 for the handbook going into Harvard.
Yeah.
You had to learn Latin and Greek.
Wow.
It says this is actually out of that. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, John 17:3. Mm-hmm. And therefore to lay Jesus Christ as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning, and seeing the Lord only giveth wisdom, let everyone seriously set himself by prayer in secret to seek it of him. That was in the Harvard handbook.
Wow.
And by the way, of the first 108 universities in the United States, 106 of them were distinctly Christian.
Wow.
Distinctly Christian. According to Donald Tewksbury in his book published in 1932, The Founding of American Colleges and Universities Before the Civil War, he said 92% of the 182 colleges and universities were founded by Christian denominations.
Wow.
So we weren't anti-education or any of that. Even some state universities, for example, the University of Kentucky, the University of California, Berkeley, can you imagine that?
Yeah.
And Tennessee had their origins as church schools.
Wow.
Can you imagine the University of California, Berkeley? You know,
I can't imagine.
the Christians coming there and say,
Yeah.
hey, listen, you know, you started with us.
Yep.
You know. But let's talk about Christianity's contributions to science.
Okay.
Lynn White is a historian of medieval science, and he stated this: the medieval monk was the intellectual ancestor of the scientist. German physicist Ernst Mach once remarked, every unbiased mind must admit that the age which the chief development of the science of mechanics took place was an age of predominantly theological cast. What is he saying? He's saying that science came out from theologians.
Yep.
And we're going to find out why in just a little bit. Alfred North Whitehead, the renowned philosopher of science, credited Christianity with the arrival of science. He said science would never have even come as we know it if it had not been for Christianity. And yet, what do we hear all the time? That Christianity is antithetical. The Christian worldview is antithetical to science. It's antiquated and anti-intellectual.
We get that constantly everywhere.
And yet the evidence, once again, and history, unless it's been revised, points to just the opposite. Now, that may sound surprising to a lot of people, including many scientists. And the reason that is the answer, it goes back to a book that was authored by Andrew Dixon White, which was published in 1896, and it was called A History of Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. And he was the first one to come out and say, no, there's this war between science and Christianity. These people are, you know, in the Stone Age here. They're just superstitious people.
Right.
Well, we're going to examine whether or not Andrew Dixon White and his bold assertions was correct. Was Christianity and science really at odds with one another, and are they at odds now?
Oh, that's good, man. Because that is all we hear now.
That's all we hear.
You don't ever hear anything other than just that.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's interesting when people say, I just believe in science, and then you start showing how unscientific their worldview is.
Yeah.
They just get angry about it, and they say, well, you Christians, you know, you don't know what you're
There
talking
you go
about.
again. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Now, let's look at this. 3 fundamental differences between Christianity and pagan religion, and remember, that's all you had in contradistinction to Christianity, that led to the arrival of science. What allowed for the Christians to discover science as we know it today that kept the rest of the world in darkness until that time? Well, here it is. The first major difference is that Christians have always believed there is only one God, and he's a rational being. Now think about Greek mythology. Think about that just a minute. Alfred North Whitehead said the origin of science required Christianity's insistence on the rationality of God, that God is an intelligent being. He's not, he doesn't just go off on a temper tantrum and go crazy, or, do like some of the Greek gods do and that sort of thing.
Right.
You don't have to appease him with, whatever.
Yeah.
And this biblical worldview enables certain Christian philosophers to link rationality with the empirical inductive method of experiment. And let me explain that. Prior to using the inductive method, all that was known or assumed to be known about nature and the universe was confined to deductive processes of the mind. In other words, I just look at something, I evaluate it, I make my logical deductions, and I arrive at a scientific conclusion.
Yep.
No experimentation, no cadavers, just, and therefore let's put a leech on Mike Rowe and bleed him out, or drill a hole in his head and, whatever. Or, put a chicken foot on him. I don't know. But their view of science was that it was all to be done through deductive processes rather than actual experiments.
Yeah.
So, can you imagine some of our greatest discoveries being arrived at by people just sitting around a room with deductive reasoning? No experiments, no lab, no nothing. That's what you had. And Robert Grosseteste was a Franciscan bishop and the chancellor of Oxford University, and he was the first one to propose the inductive experimental method. Roger Bacon was also a Franciscan monk and a student of Robert Grosseteste, and he asserted that all things must be verified by experience. He said, you can't just assume that. It's not enough. We need to experiment. We need to test that. And then Francis Bacon, almost 300 years after that, in 1561 to 1626, he gave further momentum to the inductive method by actually recording his experimental results. And he's called the practical creator of scientific induction.
Wow.
That's Francis Bacon.
Yeah.
Now, his scientific interest did not deter him from devoting great amounts of time to theology. He also wrote treatises on the Psalms and on prayer. So here's this genius, this man who is thinking way beyond his generations.
Yep.
And yet he is a devout Christian.
Something that would be unthinkable today. You wouldn't think there would be any scientist.
Oh,
This
no.
is the idea we get.
Absolutely.
That would ever think anything like
They're
that.
constantly told that. Constantly told that. Now, keep in mind that Aristotelianism, Aristotle's philosophy, had a death grip on the entire world for 1,500 years. Even in the church. A lot of superstition in the church, in the established state type of church. For 1,500 years, he held that knowledge was only acquired through deductive processes of the mind. The inductive method would have required manual activity, and that was verboten. In other words, if you were an intellectual in that era, you didn't go and pick up a cadaver and cut it open. That required work. Intellectuals intellectualized. They sat around and talked about intellectual things. That's what we do. If you wanted someone to actually do physical work, that was not an intellectual. And they were not upper crust society. And so it was looked down upon to do anything manual. So that eliminated even creating a scientific laboratory and doing scientific tests. So Aristotelianism, it held this a grip for 1,500 years on the known world. The second major difference is that Christians believe, so the first is that they believed in a rational God. They believed in a rational God. The second major difference is that Christians believe that God, who created the world, is separate and distinct from it. And once again, that clashed with Aristotelian philosophy, because Aristotle was a pantheist. He was a pantheist, and he believed that, for example, God was in nature, or gods of some sort were in nature. And for example, he believed that the planets moved by an inner intelligence called anima, that's what caused them to move. And so that belief was held for a long time until Christians came along and said, wait a minute, we don't believe in pantheism.
Yeah.
We believe in a rational God who is not part of creation. He is outside creation, and we believe he is exerting something on creation that causes it to move in a discoverable order. And so they began to look into that.
Yeah.
So he saw gods and nature intertwined, and so he believed that these gods were causing these planets to move, and that was just accepted. That's why in a lot of pagan worship, you see them worshiping planets, moons, and stars as though they're gods themselves, because they believe gods were in them.
Right.
So the pantheistic view of planetary movement was first challenged by a Christian philosopher at the University of Paris named Jean Buridan in the 1300s. He said, wait a minute, that's not right. Someone has rightly said science could never have come into being among the animists of Central or Southern Africa or many other places in the world, because they would never have begun to experiment on the natural world, since everything, whether it's stones or trees or animals or anything else within it, contain living spirits of various gods or ancestors.
Yeah.
You would have never seen it in the North American Indians, South American Indians, the tribes down in Amazon. They would have never come to scientific things, because you don't mess with gods and your ancestor spirits in nature. You just don't do it. But Christians knew better. And so the third major difference that brought about the discovery of science, or the beginning of science as we know it, is the belief that the rationality of God meant also that the universe is governed by rationally discoverable laws. And this was vitally important, because in the pagan polytheistic world that they were living in at the time, gods were often engaged in jealous, irrational behavior in a world that was non-rational.
Yep.
And thus it made any systematic investigation of the world futile. So then you have these great pioneers of science, and every last one of them were Christians.
Wow.
Every last one of them. From the 13th century on, says Lynn White, into the 18th century, every major scientist, in effect, explained his motivations in religious terms. But if one looks at the current textbooks in science, one would never know this was true.
Yep, that's right.
Today, virtually all references to the Christian beliefs of the early scientists are omitted.
Yep.
Shall I go on and talk about human psychology and biology? Or should we?
We're at 25.
We're at 25. We can stop there then.
Or maybe if you got a point or two, you want to do a quick point?
It's hard to do that, brother.
Okay.
This would probably be another 10 or 15 minutes.
We'll save that for another time.
But that's enough.
That was a wonderful and eye-opening too.
Yeah.
Because we all hear these things about how everything has been changed in the textbooks, and so we're all fed, not just through the textbooks when we were kids, but we're all fed in the media, movies, TVs, books, cartoons, you name it, something contrary than what you just told us.
Anesthesia. That was discovered by a Christian man who developed chloroform.
Mm.
Electricity.
Yeah.
The ohm meter was discovered by a Christian man.
Mm.
Volts, the measurement of volts, discovered by a Christian.
Yeah.
All kinds of things that related to science. Once this got established,
Yeah.
and once it was no longer taboo to actually study nature,
Yeah.
then the Christian world just went nuts.
Yeah.
And these guys that had these fantastic, Galileo,
Mm-hmm.
Sir Isaac Newton,
Yep.
Christians,
Yep.
brilliant thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, in their lifetime, many of them had to go before the courts,
Yep. That's right.
and they were tried.
Yep.
For heresy.
Yeah. Some of them suffered.
Some of them suffered.
Yep.
Some of them were actually given a death sentence and then quietly, no, actually, we kind of
Yeah.
believe you, so
Yeah. Uh-huh.
let's get
Yep.
this guy out of here
Yep.
and give him some money and
Yeah.
let him go on his way.
Right.
But they had to go steal cadavers off the gallows at night.
Mm-hmm.
They say that Michelangelo, the great Christian man, but they say that if you look, he would, not only was he a great artist, but he was an incredible scientist.
Mm-hmm.
They said if you took his drawings on the human anatomy, 12 volumes, you would have a complete anatomical course that is accurate to this day.
Wow.
Unheard of.
Yeah.
Just
No
unheard
kidding.
of stuff.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to add, and even our medical institutions today reflect the Christian influence.
Thank you.
Oh yeah. Sure do.
And
Holy,
and it brings us right back to the author of the human heart
Yep.
and mind
Yep.
is God himself.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And he knit us together. And
Fearfully and wonderfully.
fearfully and wonderfully made, simply to teach us that we need to stay connected to him. And the further we get away, the more problems we're going to have in
Amen.
this world today.
Yeah.
And I think your whole conversation today encourages us to walk back closer with a walk with God.
Amen.
It sure does.
Amen.
It absolutely does. It was pretty neat. And so I want to thank you, Pastor Bill and Pastor Rick, for coming in with us today,
Yes,
Brian.
Thank you. Good stuff.
Really, really awesome. Yeah, really good stuff. And we're going to hear more from these guys because I think we're going to bring them back in and we're going to do some other roundtable stuff and all kind of different stuff. And it'll
Yeah,
be kind
we'll
of
have
neat.
some
But
fun.
we'll definitely will.
right.
So